introduce people to international humanitarian law and the rules of armed conflict in international services, but also to let people know what the Red Cross is doing worldwide. And today is a unique experience because we're going to talk about what the world is doing with Red Cross in terms of climate change, but we're also going to talk about a local pilot program. And without any further ado, Nikki, would you introduce the two speakers? You're on mute, love. You're on mute, Nikki. There you go. I do that all the time.
Is it unmuted? I have such a lag here at the office. Can folks hear me? We're good? Okay, awesome. I'm used to my internet at home because I'm working from my home office normally, but today I'm actually in the Red Cross offices, and there's many of us in this office on this call.
Would people get off the visual part for right now and just turn off their cameras, except for Julie and Harrison and Nikki? That would be wonderful because that'll make less of an echo. And I just saw Christopher Lobry. Are you on? If you want to introduce yourself, you're from far away.
Good afternoon. Yes, I am. My name is Christophe Lobry-Boulanger. I'm with a volunteer with the American Red Cross. I'm the lead for international services in New York. And formerly with the Federation, I was the head of migration for the Europe region for the Federation. And before that, I was at the New York office at the delegation to the UN, the Federation delegation to the United Nations. Great pleasure to be here tonight. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you for being on. Okay, I'm sorry, Nikki, go ahead. My fault.
That's all right. I like these because they're very informal and we all jump in. So we do have two wonderful speakers today on our topics of the Red Cross and climate change and humanitarian needs both internationally and locally. So our first speaker today is Julie Arrighi. And Julie, I'm going to let you share your titles and kind of a little bit of background about yourself. But Julie is going to give us kind of an overview of climate change globally, so giving us that more kind of international perspective. And then we've also got Harrison Livesay, who's going to speak after Julie, who's going to share about a pilot program that is actually being initiated in the Central Coast chapter of the Northern California Coastal Region, who hosts these calls. About some kind of local plans that we have, some ideas and some pilot project, some relationships that we're building in order to put ourselves in the right posture and ready for when the Red Cross officially decides what it's doing for climate change and it becomes one of our goals and we can move forward with that. So we're really excited to have both of our speakers. We're hoping it'll give you a really good perspective and some insight into some of the work that's being done. So Julie, I'll let you just take it from here. And I think Mia, if you don't mind sharing the slides once Julie's introduced herself, that would be great.
Great, thank you, Nikki, and thank you also, Jill, and others who are involved in organizing this. It's really amazing to see so many folks dialing in to hear more about climate change. That's very exciting for me to see that enthusiasm. And so I'm really looking forward to the discussion part of this session at the end as well. So just briefly, I work for the International Services Division. I'm the senior advisor there, and I've worked with the American Red Cross since 2012. And I've worked in various capacities in the movement since 2009. That's half of my role is with the International Services Division. And then the other half of my time I spend working with the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center, which is a technical resource within the movement. And so between the two, I basically spend all of my time working on climate change in the context of the Red Cross. So really grateful to be here today and really looking forward to sharing the amazing experiences and stories from our Red Cross Red Crescent colleagues around the world and what they're doing in regard to climate action. So in terms of the next 20 minutes or so, I have kind of three overarching structural elements. So first is the framing, why climate change and why the Red Cross. I'm including that because especially for the American Red Cross, climate change is a newer topic. And so I think that background framing may be really helpful. And then the bulk of the time I'll spend on just a variety of examples from around the world, and then just some key takeaway messages at the end. So first, why climate change and the Red Cross? And this is really an issue of climate change and disasters. So climate change and disasters are intrinsically linked. And climate change is a humanitarian emergency that, because of its intrinsic link to disasters, disrupts and drives our mission as well. So severe weather-related disasters are more frequent, more intense, they're more volatile, and they will continue to be on the rise, continuing to become more frequent, more intense, and more volatile. And of course, disaster impacts or climate-related disaster impacts disproportionately affect the people that we serve. Just to give some examples here, a study that was done called the Cost of Doing Nothing report a couple of years ago estimated that 100 million people around the world were in need of life-saving international assistance in 2018, and that by 2050, if there's not really dedicated concerted action to prevent the rising risks, that number could double by 2050. And that number of 108 million is alarming in its own right. And then it's even more alarming when you realize that because of data limitations, that study was only looking at people who are receiving humanitarian funding that's flowing from one country to another. So it doesn't include any of the domestic responses in the US or the domestic responses in a Kenya Red Cross context or a Bangladesh Red Crescent context, et cetera. It's only these international finance flows. So the number itself, again, is much larger. And of course, the people who suffer the most from climate-related disasters are the world's most vulnerable, who more often than not are living in areas that are at heightened risk for climate-related disasters like floods, droughts, and storms. In the US context, of course, you all know this even better than I do, but disasters have become essentially a chronic condition that are no longer, or they're less episodic and more chronic, and that also increases the demand on the Red Cross mission and ability to respond and provide that basic support that's inherent to our mission and vision. So overall, the science is really clear. Frequency and intensity of extreme weather events have risen, and they will continue to rise, and this is climate change related. So why the Red Cross? Well, the disaster link is obviously one of those reasons, but then also as frontline responders, we are experts in the impacts of climate and weather-related disasters, and that expertise is crucially needed to inform and shape the decisions and actions that are taken in the climate space to stem these rising risks. But then also, because this is largely a Red Cross audience, I want to also make the case that the Red Cross is working on climate change because working on climate change is central to the principles of our movement as well. And so the reason I say this is, when we look at the principle of humanity and impartiality, our work is centered on that human perspective. And that is not a default perspective in a climate change, in the broad climate change landscape. And climate change, because it's severely impacting vulnerable people and communities around the US and around the world, our grounding principles of humanity and impartiality really call on us to prevent and alleviate that suffering, and ensuring that those actions are guided by the need and the urgency. And of course, as neutral brokers, we bring a non-political, evidence-based voice to that topic, especially in the domestic context, but globally as well, and a topic that is otherwise can be quite confusing. And being a trusted community organization, we have the ability to also provide evidence-based guidance on the meaningful actions that people can also take to prevent the consequences of climate change that are disaster-related. And this goes to the core of what we do every day, but it's adding in this element of that future look of what climate change is bringing in the future and has already brought today. And then, of course, because of the scale of the problem, it's just crucial that everyone is doing their part to take this bold and concerted climate action to prevent these consequences, such as disaster-related consequences. And being a volunteer-driven organization, we can provide that space and that opportunity for everyone to join us, whether individuals or partners, to be reducing these present and future consequences. And being a network, a global network, these core principles that we can ground our climate action in are replicated around the world through the 12 million volunteers in the global context that are working across the 165,000 local chapters and branches. And so that scale is crucial in also meeting the scale of the challenges that we face. So then in the Red Cross context as well, the network has really deep expertise and experience and has made significant commitments towards climate action in the coming decade as well. So just a couple of quick examples before going into the concrete examples of climate action. So, the Climate Center, the group that I also work with for part of my time, was founded in 2002. So the Red Cross was one of the early movers in the humanitarian space on climate action globally. The IFRC Secretariat has made climate change one of its first of 5 global challenges for the next 10 years. The ICRC has identified climate change as a strategic objective in their current strategy in the context of conflict-affected places. And of course, national societies around the world, at least more than 100, because the Climate Center supported 103 of them in 2019, and so more than 100 national societies around the world, like the American Red Cross, are taking climate action in their national context. So that's the framing. And then to jump into some of those examples of the types of actions that are being taken around the world, I've really tried to pull together a few, 6 themes basically, and they are a variety of themes. And of course, the scale of action is much broader, and there's resources that extend beyond these themes as well. But I tried to pull together a few themes that I thought could be interesting and translatable as well. So the first of those 6 themes is public education. So as a trusted organization in each of the national contexts around the world, the Red Cross really has this crucial role to play in raising awareness about climate-related disaster risks and how they're on the rise. And that's helping people to understand how the risk is evolving in their neighborhoods, in their communities, at a national scale as well, or globally. And then importantly, also equipping people with the knowledge and information about what actions they can take to reduce that risk. And to communicate that risk also involves creativity to reach people from different perspectives and through different avenues. So a couple of interesting examples of public education that are going on around the movement at the moment. One is the Red Cross has a podcast, Can't Take the Heat podcast, which is a monthly podcast covering a variety of topics where the climate meets people. And our podcast host is actually on the call today as well. So it's Roop Singh, and she can share a link to that podcast if you'd like to sign up. It's a great resource for a monthly insight into climate action going on in the world. There's also attribution. So the Red Cross Red Crescent is part of a global partnership, which basically when an extreme weather event occurs, not every, but some of the more extreme ones, there's a consortium of partners who come together to analyze it from a scientific perspective to provide guidance on how that risk may have changed due to climate change and to what extent, or if it hasn't been influenced by climate change and it's just a kind of a fluke event, then they'll communicate about that as well. The most recent example of that actually was the heat wave in the Pacific Northwest, which, without going into a lot of details about that, the really interesting finding there was essentially that heat wave would have been impossible in a world without climate change, and the likelihood of it increased by 150 times, or at least 150 times. So it's really one of the clear examples of many, but one of the most recent clear examples of climate change influencing extreme weather events. A couple of other examples, the India Red Cross has conducted heatwave flash mobs, still on the topic of heat waves, to raise awareness when a flash mob was imminent in the city of Delhi, with key actions of what people could do to protect themselves. There's some climate experts in the Red Cross who are currently working with board game developers, specifically the creator of board game Pandemic, for those of you that are familiar with that game. They're planning to release in about a year a climate-oriented board game, a cooperative board game. And so collaborating to advise on some of the humanitarian dimensions of that. And a final one for public education before I go to the next is an urban action kit. So the Red Cross recently developed, this was in partnership with the American Red Cross and others, essentially a deck of cards of simple actions that can be taken in an urban context to reduce disaster risk. Many of them are climate related, and they can be used by individuals, by groups of friends, by Red Cross branches, etc. So we can drop a link to that later as well. The next theme of things going on around the world that I'd like to highlight is youth action. So this is not only in the movement, but also globally, young people are really eager to reduce climate change impacts. I mean, we can see that just even anecdotally in the scale of people that came out for the September 2019 global climate strike. One thing though is that, and this especially applies domestically, historically climate action has often been focused on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and that's crucial, it's really important. But there's also a need to reduce these impacts of how climate has already changed today, and again, how that's being materialized in disasters. And so the Red Cross has really worked to provide these resources for young people to be able to assess and the way risks have changed in their local neighborhoods, communities, et cetera, and be part of taking action on that. So a couple of examples include some resources developed by the Climate Center called Why Adapt, which is basically a game-based curriculum for young people to assess how risks have changed and collaboratively develop solutions towards those reducing risks in their communities. The Global Youth Commission, which is part of the IFRC system, has launched a strategy around youth action. It's focused on awareness raising, actions to build resilience, and then advocacy approaches for youth perspectives to be elevated in the climate discussions. And most recently, there were some children climate cards launched, and that was a collaboration actually with the Climate Center and the GDPC. And those are for a younger age group, and they're a deck of cards that have climate missions in them to help children learn about what climate change is, learn more about its global and local impacts, and then get inspired for climate action and by stories of other children taking climate action. So those are a few youth examples. Moving on to the third of the six, urban heat risk. So I mentioned a little bit this Pacific Northwest attribution study, but one of the topics that's really rising in urgency globally, but then also in awareness of across the Red Cross movement is extreme heat. So extreme heat is deadly. It's on the rise globally. The cost, meaning the human toll of extreme heat, is preventable with really simple, low-cost actions that are really at the heart of the Red Cross mission. In the United States, heat waves are actually the deadliest weather-related hazard on average, even though often under-recognized for that. And globally, actually 2/3 of the world lives in places where extreme heat is predictable, and by being predictable, action could be taken to sort of improve comfort and safety of people around heat extremes or temperature extremes in general. There's a lot going on. So just to quickly go through some of these, the Australian Red Cross has a great program called Telecross Ready. This is a program where people who are older or maybe isolated, maybe have pre-existing medical conditions that make them particularly vulnerable to heat can sign up. And during an extreme heat event, they receive a daily phone call to check in on them. And if they are experiencing any sort of stress, they can be referred to emergency services. The program has, since its founding, actually been expanded to be multi-hazard. So now it's for disasters in general, but it was founded on heat-related risks. And then the Netherlands Red Cross has door-to-door programs. The Cascades chapter, actually, the American Red Cross, I'm sure others on this line can talk to it more, but did some really great work during the most recent heat wave with overnight cooling shelters, calling in to check on volunteers. The movement in general has resources around a heat wave guide for cities and a heat wave guide for Red Cross, Red Crescent branches and chapters that sort of elaborate on the types of actions that could be taken to reduce this risk and the way that the Red Cross could partner in those preventative actions. Another key risk that's growing in the movement is coastal risk. This is another one of the IFRC Secretariat priorities for the coming, in this case, for the coming 5 years. And when I talk about coastal risk, I'm referring to a grouping of hazards, which is sea level rise, storm surge, hurricanes or typhoons, flooding into deltas from inland rivers, saltwater intrusion, kind of any of that grouping. That's what I mean by coastal risk. And when you look globally, 800 million people are at risk of the impacts of rising seas and storm surge. And then domestically in the US, 127 million people live in coastal counties, about 40% of which are in an elevated risk category to coastal risks. So some quick examples, the Global Disaster Preparedness Centers, that's part of the American Red Cross, has worked with Red Cross societies in Myanmar, Vanuatu, Indonesia, to develop guidance materials around addressing coastal risk. Especially one great example from that is how to build coalitions and partnerships to mobilize actors to support in-kind contributions tackling these challenges. You know, when I list off all of those hazards for coastal risk, that's a lot to deal with. Sea level rise and storm surge and saltwater intrusion and hurricanes. Those are the types of things that in conglomeration, we can't do them alone, just like many other aspects of climate change. And so tools around how to bring partners together to tackle that challenge together. Coincidentally, also in Indonesia, they've had some great success with mangrove planting to help create these natural buffers against some of these climate risks to, again, reduce the impacts on people. I think there are similar examples that we could have, be inspired by and draw on and apply domestically around public awareness raising or working with local governments to consider how to incorporate these disaster risks into planning, or even looking at our own systems and how to upgrade them and make sure we're ready for increased coastal risk. Quickly moving to the next, anticipatory action is another major focus for the movement at the moment. The basic idea of anticipatory action is to strengthen our humanitarian system in overall to be more agile and scalable and responsive to the increased and dynamic needs that come with climate change. So what this means in practice is coupling forecasts with the decision making. So if a forecast of heightened risk is issued, mobilizing Red Cross volunteers for emergency preparedness efforts before that hazard is realized to help reduce the potential impacts. It can also include things like readiness to respond, which is something, of course, the American Red Cross does domestically, but is really looking at both aspects of not only the readiness to respond, but also reducing as best we can in that short window potential impacts as well. This is going on in over 30 countries. There's no way to be comprehensive with all of the work that's going on. But one example, an interesting example from Bangladesh recently in 2017 is a case of anticipatory cash payments. So a forecast was issued, cash payments were given to households in US equivalents, $60 of cash payments. And then there was a study done afterwards. What impact did this have? Did it have any meaningful impact at all? And they found, and the answer was yes, and they found that those households that received this cash were 30% less likely to take on sort of predatory high interest loans after the disaster. And there was also a 20 percentage point drop in the number of households that reported skipping 10 meals or more per day after the disaster. So really substantial numbers from from people having cash in hand before the disaster strikes to then be able to use it either to evacuate or to take preventive measures, or even just to have it available in that, after that, during the response phase. And there are examples around the world: cold waves in Morocco, anticipatory vaccines in Peru, floods, and anticipatory actions for floods in Togo, Uganda, Mozambique, etc. The Global Disaster Preparedness Center is working also on something called the Common Alerting Protocol, which is looking at how to create harmonized messages that can be deployed simultaneously across platforms to help give guidance to the public about actions to take in the event that a forecast is heightened. So the GDPC is working to expand the reach of that Common Alerting Protocol initiative as part of these efforts that sort of fall under the umbrella of anticipatory action. And then the last one, which I think is probably the least connected to the American Red Cross, but I think it's just an interesting topic, but I'll keep it brief because it is less connected, is conflict. And so specifically, the ICRC prioritizing work of climate risks in conflict areas and advocating for the needs of conflict-affected places to be considered in climate action because they are typically left behind. But conflict heightens vulnerability. And with that heightened vulnerability comes heightened climate impact. So it's really key that they are, that places in conflict are captured in these considerations despite how complicated it is. So to conclude, this is a quick survey of actions, and there's a lot more out there, and there's a lot of other topics out there as well with more actions. But overall, I mean, the take-home message is that climate and disasters are really intrinsically linked. Climate change is making them more frequent, more intense, more volatile. This means we're being impacted not only in the need to respond and be able to adapt our humanitarian systems to respond better, but also in this really increasingly urgent need to reduce vulnerability and exposure at a household and neighborhood level to build resilience to prevent these disasters as best we can. And because of these two different angles, climate change is inherently important to the Red Cross being able to meet its mission globally. And the Red Cross is a leader in this space globally and the humanitarian intersection of climate action. And of course, these lenses really apply strongly to the American Red Cross, and it's a space the American Red Cross can also be filling domestically. So thank you a lot, and I really look forward to the conversation.
And
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Julie. That was super interesting. So I think, Jill, well, I'd like to know what you think, but maybe a few questions now for Julie, and then Harrison can present, or would you like to?
no, I'd prefer that Harrison gets to present, and then they can have a dialogue with each other as well as we could answer. But feel free, any of you, to put your questions in the chat. So in case your memory is short, you have them down there, and we'll make sure to cover them. And also at the end, we can make sure to address those to whoever needs to be addressed. So yes, if it would be okay. Is that okay with you, Julie? That if we wait for questions till afterwards?
That's absolutely fine. And these questions on the slide here are questions that I have for all of you. So I'm looking forward to hearing your answers to them as well.
Wonderful. And that's great. Okay.
Excellent. So Harrison, I think you're on. I hope you're on. I hadn't seen you yet, but I think
Would you like to introduce him?
Initials there. So Harrison is one of our wonderful Central Coast Climate Change Task Force leaders, a wonderful group that Jill mentioned earlier that's really leading some pilot program initiatives around climate change in our Central Coast chapter in the Northern California coastal region. Harrison, I'm not sure if you have slides that you'd like to share or if you're just going to speak, but you're up. We'd love for you to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about the work that the task force is doing.
All right, thank you so much, Nikki. I do have some slides. Let me try to pull them up.
Could you show yourself too?
I'm having a lot of internet connectivity issues over here. So
okay.
Just for the sake of the quick presentation, I'm going to keep the video off because it's seeming to cause a lot of problems every time I turn it on. Can everyone see this though? The screen I have pulled up?
Yeah. I can see it. Thanks, Harrison.
Okay. So as Nikki said, my name is Harrison Livesay. I am a current graduate student at the Middlebury Institute International Studies, and I'm pursuing my master's in international environmental policy. I'm also a founding member of the steering committee for the Climate Change Task Force. We're a pilot project that operates in the Northern California coastal region under the supervision of International, and we are very, very new, brand new, in fact. This project launched as recently as February, and we're still in the initial phases of activation, but I just want to give a very brief overview today of who we are and what we're working on by touching on three salient points here. So the first is partnerships. Our ultimate goal is to collaborate with organizations and agencies within the Northern California coastal region that work in climate change adaptation, right? So our goal is not to reinvent the wheel, but rather engage with existing projects designed by organizations that have a longer history with this kind of work. Next, we have our pillars, or our areas that we intend to engage. These include agriculture and food, human health, individual actions, racial equity and diversity, citizen science, risk reduction, renewable energy, and food and housing. And then lastly, I just want to touch on our emphasis here. So we want to focus on addressing the needs of the most vulnerable communities that stand to suffer most from the adverse effects of climate change. It was something that Julie had briefly mentioned in her presentation, but one of the twisted paradoxes of this whole field is that oftentimes those who contribute least to climate change, they disproportionately incur the most severe effects and have the least amount of resources to cope. So these are communities that we want to get a lot of special attention to. All right, and next, I just want to quickly define climate change adaptation. I realize this is a phrase that gets thrown around a lot, and people can kind of get confused by exactly what it means. It oftentimes gets confused with climate change mitigation, which is it's related to and could perhaps be thought of as its twin, but they are distinctly separate. So this is my personal definition that I like. It seems to be pretty straightforward and concise. So what is climate change adaptation? Climate change adaptation is any action taken by individuals or communities to adjust to the current or anticipated effects of climate change in a manner that maintains their livelihoods. So climate change adaptation, or CCA, could include everything from physical relocation of individuals, families, or communities, to developing green spaces in urban centers to assist with flood control and water retention during storm surges. It could also include planting drought-tolerant crops or more nature-based solutions like coastal ecosystem restoration, wetland restoration, kelp forest restoration, things like this. So these are some of the projects that my team and I are aiming to be a part of and that we're investigating within the purview of our region. And at the moment, my team and I are continuing to develop climate change adaptation resources for the Red Cross. We're investigating, like I said, and reaching out to local organizations working within this space. And our ambition ultimately is to build a model that could be replicated. So we want to scale up and build a model that could be replicated and maybe provide guidance to other chapters throughout the country after we get a little traction. And now lastly, I was asked by Jill to sort of give a little bit about my backstory and my personal testimony for how I got involved in this particular field of work and where my interest comes from with all of this. And I'll start by saying my path to this field has been really anything but straightforward. To borrow a phrase from one of my current professors, I was a lowly history major as an undergrad. And I actually ended up selecting Swahili as my language requirement for that degree program in preparation to apply for a teaching position in Tanzania with the Peace Corps. So shortly after I graduated in 2014, I applied, got accepted to serve abroad, did 3 months of training with the Peace Corps, sworn at the embassy, and then I was sent to work in a remote and scattered village called Suji. And Suji sits high in the northernmost block of the Eastern Arc Mountains of Kilimanjaro region. So this is the northeastern part of the country, not too far from the Kenyan border for those who are familiar with East African geography. And Suji is really just a stunningly beautiful place. I mean, I have an image here taken from the backside of my house when I lived there. And even this doesn't really capture how remarkable the landscape is. From the backside, I mean, straight ahead to the north, you could see Mount Kilimanjaro. To the west, you could see the vast stretches of the Maasai Steppe. And to the east, right behind the village, there was a nationally protected rainforest called Shangena. long story short, there were a lot of politics involved that I won't bore everyone with today, but when I arrived to Tsuji, the school I worked at didn't make much use of me as a teacher, and I ended up founding and instructing a youth self-defense and martial arts program, which really became the heart and soul of my service. A bit of context, I spent the last 25 years of my life in martial arts and combat sports and reality-based self-defense training. But anyways, the point being, I had a ton of flexibility in my schedule and inevitably a lot of free time, which I spent almost exclusively exploring that adjacent rainforest. So this forest and community really became my second home. I think, like most Peace Corps volunteers, I was totally invested in the area that I was living. Over time, however, as I explored this forest reserve, I began to encounter a variety of illegal operations and human activities that were degrading this beautiful place. I saw firsthand things like mining and pit saw operations, as well as out of control fires that just ravaged the landscape. And these experiences prompted me to conduct my own sort of amateur research on where I lived, just out of sheer curiosity. And I came to discover two important facts that truly changed the trajectory of my life. One that excited me, and one that deeply, deeply disturbed me. The first was learning how uniquely important this forest actually is. Shangena is a slice of a much larger forest system that cloaks the entire Eastern Arc Range, and it contains some of the richest biodiversity, not just on the continent, but on planet Earth. And these forests are also extremely ancient. They predate even the emergence of Mount Kilimanjaro itself, and they've been maintained for millions of years, primarily by monsoonal rains off the Indian Ocean. They provide countless ecosystem services to a large number of Tanzanians, everything from cultural to provisioning to regulating services. To give you an example, 25% of Tanzanians, so roughly a quarter of the population, gets their daily water from sources that originate within these forests. It's an immensely important area. Now, the second thing I learned was that 80% of the Eastern Arc Mountains' historical forest extent has already been lost, largely due to 19th and 20th century colonial extractive industries, alongside unsustainable local activities over time. This was really, really shocking to me. You know, when you're standing deep in the middle of this canopied forest, you look around and you really just think to yourself, it's amazing. You think, wow, this is a pristine, untouched wild place, and it must just extend for miles and miles on end. I mean, everywhere you look, it's just green, covered canopy. And then you do a little research and you take a look at the maps and the aerial photographs that demonstrate just how much has been lost in the last few centuries, and it's truly disturbing. So what I learned was that these forests are diminishing rapidly, and the specter looming ominously over this whole process was climate change. These destructive human activities I was just talking about, when combined with climate change, they form an existential juggernaut. Like so many forest systems around the world, the Eastern Arc Mountain forests are facing potential annihilation amidst the onslaught of climate change. And this made an immense impact on my worldview, on my outlook, on everything in my life. So fast forward a couple of years, and I simply couldn't ignore these findings, and ultimately decided to recalibrate my entire professional path towards finding adaptive solutions to climate change in this region of the world. And ultimately, my goal is to return in a more professional capacity to work alongside the organizations that are already doing so much to preserve these forests in Tanzania. So this, of course, led me to graduate school at Middlebury for environmental policy, where I was introduced to our passionate leader, Jill Hoffman, who recruited me to be a part of this Red Cross climate change pilot project. And I just want to say I'm unbelievably excited and honored to be a part of it. So that's a bit about me and how I arrived here today, and kind of what we have on the menu for our pilot project working towards the future.
I just have one really quick question for you. Somebody else raised their hand. Oh,
Sure.
Would you explain very specifically what might be a pilot project for our Central Coast chapter?
Yeah, sure. So, as I mentioned, we've investigated a handful of different possible partnerships. One of the more salient things we're looking into is partnering with organizations like the Coastal Wetlands Group, who do a lot of very basic but important work with restoring coastal wetlands and ecosystems along Monterey and the coast in that area. And this, like I said, this is an ecosystem-based approach to climate change adaptation that bolstering these sorts of ecosystems it's going to assist local communities in adapting to the worst effects of sea level rise, flooding, storm surges, etc. So we're looking at things like that. We also are right now investigating a potential partnership with the Santa Cruz Fire Council. They help communities that are very vulnerable to wildfires figure out preparatory measures, adaptation measures, and things like that. And of course, given the Red Cross's history in disaster services, that seems to be kind of a shoe-in for us. And there's a lot of resources and information we can exchange from both sides of the coin.
Thank you, Harrison. This is the time now where you can bring up your questions, and also Julie, if you wanted to put your slide back up, your last slide, maybe you can ask, first of all, Julie, if you can tell me how you ended up working in climate change. If you could just give a really quick synopsis of how you as a human being got involved in climate change. And then maybe do the slide, your last slide presentation of having to do, yeah, that one. And then people can answer that if they feel like it, or they can ask questions. Please unmute yourself and ask. Don't feel shy. Unmute yourself and ask a question, or raise your hand, or put it in the chat, whatever's comfortable for you. But this is your time now to ask both Harrison, who's local, and Julie, who works with the Global Climate Center as well as with the American Red Cross on climate change. You can ask them anything. This is your time.
So Jill, to quickly answer your question, as people think of other questions to ask, I guess the short version would be, so I grew up in a rural part of the US, actually on a farm. And so weather and environment has always sort of been just part of the day-to-day. And I think my dad was also a great educator. So when we would be working together, there was always a lesson about something environmental or weather related. And that really then influenced what I studied in college and grad school. Not directly, but I ended up back in that space, let's say, when I reached those studies. And then from there, ended up in the Red Cross, actually in East Africa as well. So, but Uganda in particular, and Kenya, for about 7 years in total of my Red Cross time. And then the rest of the Red Cross time has been back in the States, but supporting internationally.
Thank you, Julie. So please ask questions. This is your time to ask questions and start the discussion. And I'd be really curious. Somebody in the chat just wrote something down. With the vast amount of money and resources, the responses to climate change will surely involve. I wonder what role do you see for financial supporters of the American Red Cross in our work? I don't know if it's Miss or Mr. Kern left this message. And what examples of this support are already happening? I guess that's a Julie question, isn't it? Because locally we don't do the finances.
Yeah, I'm interested by, so I have two interpretations of this question in my mind, so I'm going to try to answer both really quickly, and if it's wrong, then you can clarify. So I think on one hand, there's the sort of financial service provider perspective of all of this, which may or may not be the angle to this question, but I think one of the interesting things an interesting space at the moment is this concept of anticipatory cash, which I mentioned very briefly. And where that becomes really interesting from like a financial service provider perspective is how to, well, similar to our response issues, how to reach lots of people very, very quickly. So if you imagine a forecast of 10 days out, how can you reach 1 million people in 2 of those days so that people have time to take action with the remaining 5? And that has a host of issues with it. And they're all really interesting and complex. And that could be one angle to that. I think the other angle I just interpret that as is, what can donors do to support the Red Cross? And I guess for folks who are interested in climate change and its impacts, the unique offering of the Red Cross is that human-centered focus on the impacts of disasters. Okay, great. And so that's another angle. So then the angle that you're referring to, sorry, corporates and foundations, how can they get involved? This is a really interesting question. I can actually drop a longer paper into the chat box where we've tried to tackle this recently in a sort of a white paper. But in the corporate sector, you have a host of corporates, in fact, most of the ADGP lists that have committed to environmental sustainability measures, and that's generally their commitment for climate action. And that has made them leaders in this space, and now that's sort of widely accepted as what you need to do from a public perspective. So I think that the next space that will like separate the leaders from everyone is this investment in community resilience and that angle of climate change. And I think that's where there's really interesting partnership potentials with the Red Cross and corporates. So that could be the direct funding of community resilience, but it could also be looking at the corporate perspective of community resilience. So looking across, for example, their supply chains and how can they ensure that the communities that are part of their supply chains are invested in with resilience measures, which becomes a win-win, not only from a corporate perspective, but also from that community's perspective to be more resilient against climate change. Those are a couple of examples, and that's a great question.
Thank you.
Please don't be shy. Feel free to answer Julie's questions or come up with your own. This is your time to ask, because this is such a new field that we're dealing with in terms of looking at, it's not a new field in terms of disaster, but how do we help mitigate and adapt to the issues having to do with increased disasters due to climate change. Here's a 12th grade educator who asks, what resources do we have to educate our youth in and out of the classroom to foster community climate advocacy?
Yeah, advocacy. So there's a few resources on climate action. And so I'll list those off. There's this Why Adapt module, or sorry, a set of resources that the Climate Center has produced. There's the climate action card, the children's climate cards. Actually, some of the aspects in the urban action kit could be relevant for youth, older youth as well. Advocacy in particular, I am not currently aware, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist, of advocacy specific resources for youth. I do think that this is a crucial area, and I think there's an immense potential for the American Red Cross to collaborate with youth in that space in particular. But I will need to do a little bit of research to see if advocacy is integrated in some of the tools I mentioned, or if there's other tools out there that I'm not aware of yet. So if you leave your email in the chat, I can get back to you on that, or send me an email at the address on the screen if you don't want to share it in the chat.
Harrison, do you want to talk to those? And I have some answers too.
Yeah, sure. I can just briefly mention that it'll be a plug for the associate board for our chapter. But what we're starting to do with that particular program is actually engage the younger generations and recruit them into the Red Cross sphere, specifically with regards to to climate change and climate change adaptation. And so my team, actually another member on the team, she's actually working on developing some resources specifically for educational resources for youth and for K through 12 students. I don't know exactly how much of it pertains to advocacy, but it's definitely related.
The other thing is, if Harold Brooks is still on the call, Harold, would you talk about your wonderful program that you're semi-involved in? If you would get online and share that. Are you still on the call, Harold? Yeah.
Yes, I am. And I anticipated, Jill, that you would put me on the spot. And a warm hello to Julie. She's one of the smartest people I ever had the opportunity and privilege to work with. So glad to know you're online and doing this wonderful work. So I actually have a question before I talk about the climate initiative, our Kennebunkport climate initiative, and it's to Harrison. I'm wondering, you mentioned that you wanted to partner with Northern California, climate change advocates and organizations. Is there an appetite, to do something broader than that? And the reason I ask that, Harrison, is you seem to have an expansive sort of a mindset, and you're on your way back to Kenya, which I lived in for 2 years and have a soft spot in my heart for it too, right next door in Tanzania as well. Kennebunkport Climate Initiative is an organization that currently has an executive director named Jono Anzalone, who used to be the senior VP for international services at the American Red Cross. And the big focus of that organization is to get youth engaged, involved, and on fire when it comes to dealing with the climate change, sea level rise, et cetera. I would love to figure out a way to have what you're trying to do link up with Kennebunkport Climate Initiative as they expand beyond just Maine or Kennebunkport and try to go nationwide with one of their first priority countries, states that is, being California. So long-winded way of asking you, Harrison, is there an appetite and an interest in doing that? And same question to you, Jill.
Hey, Harold. Yeah, I appreciate the question. And I got to say, we have a large appetite, and I think my team is quite insatiable when it comes to this particular project. What we learned in the early months was that we tried to go a little too fast, and we set our sights a little too high, and it caused a lot of stumbling blocks for us. So what we've done right now is kind of narrowed our field of vision. So we're gonna focus just on our chapter for at least the next few months and try and get a little traction, have some success, establish some official partnerships. But the goal has always been to scale up and to expand this thing. And right now we've got both the blessing and the curse of being ahead of the curve for the Red Cross in this field, with it being a pilot project. So we're really just trying to figure out our kinks, and to give you a bit of information about our timeline right now, what we've been told is that we'll have boots on the ground hopefully by September, October. So our goal right now is to have a menu of options, say 4 to 5 potential partnerships within our particular region that we can provide to the leaders of our task force, and get the green light for activating those partnerships, and then moving towards the next year. We want to expand that, and then, like I said, be able to provide sort of a template and an institutional history of how we went about things, highlighting both our failures and successes to help other chapters and organizations.
Great, thank you.
And to answer your question, Harold, I'm always open for communicating with other regions and other chapters and other divisions or whoever is working on climate change, because I feel like it's sort of something like horrible wildfires catches. That's a negative view, where wildfire catches on really quickly, but also in terms of being able to catalyze and spearhead enthusiasm in other areas to continue on pilot programs. As far as I know, listening to Noel Anderson, Omar and Julie and Anne, a number of people up at National, we're the only ones that have started doing a pilot project, and we're starting very small, and we're doing what Jennifer Adrio has suggested we do, which is pick only the low-hanging fruit to begin with. In other words, have a small success and then build on that. And then we can establish a foundation to build more and more within our region. So in terms of educational materials in our region, I put my email in the chat. You can contact me. But one of the reasons why, Harold, I asked you to speak is because you're the website of, and maybe you can put in the chat your organization, the website that your organization has is one of the best for teaching K through 12 information on what to do. And one of the innovative projects that Harold's program works with is they have a bus that goes out with high school kids and middle schools in it, and it travels the community and it points out areas where the community is at risk due to climate change and due to increased disasters. So kids are being educated at the same time they're having an experiential experience. So I just love your program, and I hope you put it in the chat.
Yes,
Put
ma'am.
the content. Oh, you did. Oh, good.
I will, as always, do as I'm told. I do, Julie, want to ask you if there's any thought of collaborating with an organization like Kennebunkport Climate Initiative to take that great material that Red Cross is known to produce and getting it into the schools, the public schools, not just in the United States, but around the world. And how are you going to do that? I think KCI would be a great source of energy to help you guys to do that. Any comment or thought?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. And it's so lovely to see you again. And thank you for the kind word earlier as well. You know, I think when it comes to climate change, partnerships are crucial. No one can tackle this challenge of climate change without partnerships. And so in that sense, I think there should be great interest. In terms of the American Red Cross's domestic priorities on climate change, those are still being shaped. So it's certainly my hope that youth programs in schools will form a significant part of that. It's decisions still to be made, let's say, but I think that, you know, the potential of collaborating with initiatives like the Kennebunkport Climate Initiative and with you know, public schools to educate and inform youth across the age spectrum about climate action is just fundamentally crucial to what we need to do. So I'm really hopeful about that.
Great, thank you. All right.
There was a question, I think, in the chat. Oh, I think somebody put in a white paper. Thank you for doing that. Okay, I'm wondering if people could respond to Julie's questions. Is there anybody brave enough to unhook themselves? And Christopher, I see you. I don't know if you had a question or not.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jill, and thank you for the opportunity to hear about such an important topic. Congratulations to Julie and group also, and thank you for the information that left on the chat. It's a great pleasure to see Harold again. I would begin by saying that, to my sense, the term climate change really does not convey the urgency that is related to the state of our world today. And connected to this, I was wondering if in the education programs and various youth activities, they have ways to really make the next generation understand in very concrete terms, perhaps with metrics. How can we make people understand the effect of the climate emergency that we live in terms of people affected and how, but also in terms of solutions, in very concrete ways what the effect of mitigating activities or actions, how many people does that affect, and how does that concretely contribute to a solution to the climate emergency that we live in. And finally, Julie and Roop, you have the experience of a global approach with the Climate Center, and with societies similar to ours, perhaps. Do you have success stories that the American Red Cross could benefit from? And also connected to the global perspective that you have, is there ways that, I mean, I'm part French and part German, aside from living this country here for the past 30 years. Is there any way that we can leverage events such as what is happening in Germany today? How can we bring it to the American society and make them understand what is going on in Ruhrgebiet and Belgium, Holland, and Western Germany, for example, to something that could translate into understanding and action here at the local level? Thank you again.
Yeah, great. Thank you for that question. Harrison, do you want to take this one first, and then I can supplement and add on? Or do you prefer a different approach?
Yeah, sure, that's fine.
Go ahead, Harrison.
I would say, just from my personal experience, you know, if we're talking about trying to truly convey, like you were saying, the urgency of the climate crisis, speaking more to people's values and providing personal stories and case studies is the way that I've been able to get through to people. It's the way that other organizations that I've been a part of, that's a tactic that they've used. You know, infiltrating educational materials as much as possible with these sorts of testimonies and stories. The difficult part, I think, is getting educational systems on board with all of that. You know, I know there's, at least in the United States, there's a lot of politics involved that can really muddy the waters. But that's my individual perspective. I'm sure, Julie, you have more you could share from your experience.
Julie, before you say one thing, one of the things that was innovative in years and years ago when we tried to do the measles rubella initiative, and nobody knew about measles being the #1 killer in the world for children under the age of 5. We did a thing which we did a photo essay contest. So we did we had people take photographs, and then we had them do stickers and post stickers that they created, and then we had a contest. So we got youth involved by having them take photographs of their community. And that might be, and I know other national societies have done this, take pictures, because if you tell somebody, hey, you're going to die from climate change in the next 5 years, nobody's going to believe you. And everybody becomes really defensive and puts their head sort of like an ostrich in the ground. But if you have them become aware and ask those open-ended questions of, instead of saying, what do you know about climate change, saying, how has your community been affected by the recent climate? And then they start talking. Or if they take photographs of their own community and begin to do that, and students do that really openly, they carry their selfies around. Is it called selfies? They carry their iPads or their iPhones or their smartphones around and take pictures of each other. They can take pictures of the environment and then share those with the community, and questions start being asked. So anyway, I'm going to shut up now. Julie, please.
That's a great example. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Yeah, to the earlier question about learning from other national societies, I think and there's just an immense amount of knowledge to learn from. You know, the Climate Center can be a resource for brokering some of those connections to anyone who is interested. On the topic, I'll just pick one random topic on the topic of extreme heat. I think there's a lot of lessons that American Red Cross Domestic could learn, especially from national societies in Europe. And I say Europe in particular because they faced a particularly deadly heat wave in 2003. Roughly 70,000 people died as a result of that heat wave when looking back at the historical records of excess mortality. And so there's been an immense amount of effort since then to create better preparedness systems and to try and reduce those risks when heat events occur. And unfortunately, lots of people are still impacted, but it is significantly less. I know as well that my colleague Roop, who has been mentioned a couple of times on this call, has had some really interesting conversations in Bangladesh. So I wonder, Roop, would you want to share that experience as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Julie. Thanks, everyone. Just saying hi, my name is Roop. I also work with Julie at the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center. And Julie and I talk a lot about heat, and that's because we've spent a lot of time working on heat, but I guess I just wanted to share one of my experiences. So I had the opportunity to work with the Bangladesh Red Crescent a couple of years ago and talk to them about a study that we had sort of commissioned that said essentially hundreds of people, if not thousands of people, had died during an eight-day period of extreme heat. But given that Bangladesh is a country that's where it's hot year-round, it's not really recognized as a risk. And so one thing that we did is we went and we talked about it, but then I also had this really great opportunity to talk with the young volunteers in the Bangladesh Red Crescent in Dhaka. And we, together with them, we held like a training on like, how do you recognize the signs of heat illness, but then also can we generate some ideas of what can we do in our own local community about this? And they actually generated a lot of really cool ideas. And what's been really nice is that over the years, just recently, they've developed sort of a heat wave program within the city of Dhaka. So just to see that progression over time, I think there's lots of examples of that. And I think people being able to see how it affects them personally. So like bringing up the point that of how the climate has changed in Bangladesh over time and how perhaps their grandparents who might have high blood pressure are affected when it gets really hot really brings it home. And then to also see that something that wasn't thought of as an issue, say 3 or 4 years ago, now has its own sort of heat program has been really awesome. And I hope that these are some things that might also happen within the American Red Cross. I'll leave it there, Julie.
Thanks, Ruth.
Would you be willing to talk about one idea, Roop, that the youth came up with, 1 or 2 ideas that you really loved?
Yeah, so they had tons of ideas, and they also picked up ideas from other regions sort of nearby. So for example, in India, one of the things that people are doing is they're starting to paint rooftops white because that reflects heat. So that's one thing that they were really keen to do. But then also just really simple actions like going door to door. If they were thinking that they want to connect with another organization that works specifically with elderly folks. And so they would recognize where do the sort of most vulnerable people live in the city. And then when there was a forecast of a heat wave, they would go door to door and just be like, hey, how are you doing? Do you have access to water today? Can I bring you anything? And just that like very little thing of being able to ask someone if they have access to cooling or water really makes a huge difference. So those were some of the examples.
Thank you. Thanks, Roop. Okay, this is your wonderful opportunity to ask any questions or concerns in the chat or to answer some of Julie's questions, because I like her questions. I have them here once again. I thought one of them that was really interesting is what creative ideas to carry forward in climate action in your location? because when I looked at the wide variety, you come all the way up from Alaska to New York, to California, to Oregon, to Texas. What kinds of ideas does this sort of challenge you to look at within your own location or your own community? So anybody want to pipe up either in the chat or unmute your mic and share with us? Be brave.
Hello, this is Kiran Magiawala,
Yes.
Los Angeles.
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you, ma'am. I regularly post a lot of interesting articles on our Yammer websites of various regions around the country and try to bring in the examples from those regions which are related in my mind with climate change related issues. And I have also created a climate and a sustainability Yammer feed, and I welcome anybody and everybody to post, the articles which are relevant there. And for example, I have put climate change related issues in Alaska community, also in Florida communities, as well as in southern part of Louisiana communities. And these are very specific examples. And of course, it will require, little different kind of engagement. That was the first point I wanted to share. And the second point which I wanted to share was in response to what Ms. Roop Singh mentioned about this cool roof approach. As you know, the efforts on a part of Noel Anderson and others are emerging. One of the focus I perceive, and I could be in error, is the, scope 1 and scope 2 emission reductions for Red Cross as a whole. And scope 1 will relate to all our vehicle related logistics. And scope 2 will be amount of energy which we purchase and try to, go for a little greener approaches. And in a scope 2, I see a direct impact of these cooler roofs, and at least whatever 800 facilities and business centers we have around the country, they could look into what might be the resources needed to do those kind of a simple thing. And when it comes to community engagement, the new subject which has been discussed, at least in my reading, through the forest related professional organizations in the US is the tree equity subject. And what they are doing is they have now maps on community by community where there are lesser number of trees in the cities and trying to correlate with them with the delta T in those communities. And those kind of information will catch immediate attention in my mind when we go down and talk to few communities. And the third point I wanted to, in the last point, I wanted to share, and for which I have sent Jill you one email before, and I have forwarded that email today to both Nikki and Harrison. And that is in a reference to the California Insurance Commission has started a new group in the last year and a half called Climate Insurance Group. They are dealing with quite a few professional insurance companies which are dealing with, say, giving the insurance to me for my home related to climate. And in that one, after doing their due diligence both on the local propagation as well as the past history, they are in a lookout for, this is my interpretation, for risk communication related input. And there, as one of the interests which Harrison had on a partnership, one can at least explore whether they will entertain engaging with the Red Cross if Red Cross has that interests. And of course, after that, they have two other steps: risk mitigation and then risk transfer. And what essentially they have developed, and this is with the Wharton Risk Center, is called a community insurance for climate-related catastrophe. And that construct is a very interesting construct. That rather than me buying a, insurance for my home, 20 homes around me will be buying, some kind of a joint risk related purchase. And thought I will share all these 3 points and will be available on a Red Cross email or on a Yammer, to talk to anybody. Thank you for the time here.
Sure, thank you. I wanted to share with you one of the last questions in here is from Tennyson, sorry, B. Tennyson. I live in Aquan, Juneau, and Alaska. Aquan is the front line of climate change. It's extreme. I would like to start paying attention to more the agencies in climate adaptation versus conservation. We had a huge win in Southeast today for conservation. However, I'm curious which ones are focusing on reality and impact on humans. That was a question. And then similarly, she'd like to look for agencies or people interested in climate adaptation and environment peace building in Alaska. I can share a little bit and then I'd love Julie or Harrison. One of the first things I did, mainly because I've lived here so long in Santa Cruz for our local climate adaptation, is I contacted the government because I figured they must have some kind of either city government or state government must have plans for climate adaptation, excuse me. And I was able to find people who had either created the plans or were in the process of immediately addressing the crises. So government agencies is a wonderful resource. Contacting universities anywhere near you, because they're usually doing research on environmental studies or in some aspect of disaster and climate change. And the third one is working with local community natural leaders, which is always important, especially looking at the diversity in your community and finding out natural leaders and finding out what effects they're having from the climate change and what they feel will help them best. In other words, ask them what they need rather than making assumptions about, oh, it's a calamitous event, we've got to respond to it. Ask people what they think needs to happen around climate change. I'm sorry, either Julie or Harrison, do you want to go on?
I think those are great recommendations, Jill. I would start in exactly the same place. On a quick look, Roop also just found what looks like a promising group. I'll drop that in the chat as well. We were just messaging behind the scenes to see if we could swap notes on any particular groups in Alaska. But I think what you said is great. And then I would just also make an offer that if there's a group that you're thinking could be interesting to work with and you just want a quick, skim to see if they, seem to be on top of the latest climate stuff, then feel free to also drop an email and we can, ask around or whatever. But I would start with those two resources that Jill mentioned, universities and local government. I think it's a great start.
Don't forget the natural leaders.
Yeah, and the only thing I would add to that, I think those are great recommendations. Unfortunately, I don't have any information pertaining specifically to Alaska, but I know that most cities in the United States have either and or environmental or climate change impact assessments or climate change vulnerability assessments, and oftentimes those documents contain information regarding different organizations or agencies that are working specifically in certain areas pertaining to climate change. But that's, you bring up a really good point, how sometimes it can seem like there's a disconnect between conservation and the human impact when it comes to climate change. And I can just say personally, with the the climate change task force, that's something we're really trying to focus on is bridging that gap and sort of articulating what the human impact is, because of course, humans in nature, they're not separate, they're interconnected, but sometimes that gets lost in translation. I mean, I know, Jill, we talked about certain projects, at least in California and the northern coastal area, that are dealing with helping to relocate vulnerable communities such as homeless encampments or low-income communities that live in riparian areas that are currently being severely affected by sea level rise, flash floods, irregular seasonal patterns, things like that.
There was, I think there was one more question. I'm trying to see if I can answer that. Okay. Oh, I forgot what I was going to say. Anything? What I'd say is reach Julie, reach myself, or reach Harrison if you want to communicate further on any of these questions. And then the other thing is somebody just Kieran put in climate change is rapidly transforming the Arctic, why everyone should care. And I have a list of movies that might be really useful for you to take a look at in terms of climate change that for instance, in our own region, we have a movie night. And so we put pertinent things that are happening around the world into that movie night, and a whole bunch of people come and get educated and then get inspired to either volunteer or do more action in the community. The other thing I was going to share with you is if there, let me ask you one last time, are there any more questions before we go on? I just have a couple of ways to sort of wind up. If anybody has any questions, this is the time to ask them. Raise your hand, open your mic, put your information on the chat. Well, anyway, while I'm talking, if something comes up, feel free to put it in the chat. One of the things we do is every month we have this discussion group, and every month we have a speaker come or speakers come and talk about something that's pertinent that's happening around the world. And I first of all want to thank big time both Julie, who took time out of her crazy busy schedule ever since she took on climate change, I'm sure, in national, and Harrison, who works full time and is going to be a full-time student in August. I don't know how he's going to do that, but he also is doing climate change tirelessly, as are his other three or four people who have been working with him on the steering committee. I want to thank you both for coming. You've been amazing support to me and the whole chapter in the Central region. We picked the Central region because we have the fires, we have the debris flows from the fires, we have floods, we have sea level rising, and we have wetland destruction. So those are 5 things within the climate change pillars that we're dealing with. And we have very low income and most vulnerable and undocumented people who are at biggest risk and that get flooded out almost every year. So that's why we chose this particular chapter. The other thing I wanted to let you know is the speaker forum that we have. Next month, we will have Sean Hazeldine, who is this wonderful man from the Ceferino Society in Geneva, Switzerland, which is part of the IFRC-ICRC movement, which is International Federation and International Committee of Red Cross. And he will be speaking about his journey on how he became involved in the Ceferino Society, but innovative programs that the Red Cross is doing. And we're hoping to have in a few months, Pablo Suarez, who is an amazing, amazing person that works for the Climate Change Center. It'll be probably in the next few months. We hope to have him come and speak on what's happening globally. And he has a beautiful TED Talk that I highly recommend called Humor in Humanitarian Crisis. And he is one of the major work people within the global climate change. And there's another TED Talk that I highly recommend for those of you interested in climate change. It's called the banana slug theory. It's easy to remember. Think of banana slug theory. or the Banana Slug by Tim, Tim Goncharoff, Tim Goncharoff, which is what a little town can do. And that's my hometown of Santa Cruz, so I'm very biased. And it's called the banana slug syndrome or something like that. In any case, you can look it up in TED Talks. And the other thing is by Pablo Suarez from the Global Climate Center in Geneva. And he has a wonderful TED Talk on humor and the humanitarian response. So both of those are things having to do with climate change, having to do with the Red Cross. But the TED Talk by Tim is about what a small city can do to change large corporations like Starbucks and the Creamery. So there's one more question in the box, and then I think we need to stop as it's 3:30.
Hey,
Oh,
Jill, I just posted a link to Tim Goncharoff's TED Talk on YouTube in the chat if anybody wants to swipe that. It really is a great talk.
And what about Pablo's? Is that the second one, or did you do both of them?
Julie posted Pablo's, yes.
Oh, super. So I highly recommend those. And I want to thank Julie and her team for all the wonderful support they've been giving us locally. And Nikki, my fearless, wonderful leader, and for Michelle and all the other people in our chapter who are our staff who have been being great support to this wonderful steering committee and task force. I want to thank you all for attending. I think this is one of the highest attendances we've ever had for a talk. We had over 90 people. So great thank yous to all of you who are willing to participate from all over the United States. Contact any one of us and we'll try to answer any questions that come up for you or any support that you need in your local area. Yeah. Oh, I think thank you everyone. I'll be reaching out to all of you to see how we can get this information into our K-12. That's Candace. You'll be getting an email from Candace. She's going to reaching out on K-12 information. And that's it. In any case, thank you all for all of you for being here. And Julie Arrighi just put her email in the chat. And Harrison is Harrison Livesay at redcross.org.
That's correct. I'll put it in the chat as well.
Thank you. And so we'll put those in. Thank you all for being so wonderful and being attentive to us for this talk today. And with that, we're going to say goodbye to you. Bye, Christoph. Thank you very much for being on this call.